The quiet of early morning didn't last long on Bloomfield Street. A small house with fading white paint sat still under the pale sky. Windows shut, yard silent. Nothing about it worth a second look. Yet, that ordinary house held a secret that had escaped justice for almost half a century. No one walking past it would know that a man inside had lived every day as if time owed him something. Inside, someone was waking up like any other day, unaware that his long-kept truth was about to be ripped open. A tactical team moved into position, boots soft on the pavement, breath steady and controlled. Their hands tightened on door-breaching gear. It wasn't a chaotic takedown like the ones seen on television. It was quiet, sharp, and fast. Within seconds, the door split open under force. Wood cracked, hinges snapped, and officers rushed into the hallway where the air felt strangely calm, as if the house itself recognized the moment it had been waiting for. Feet pounded through the narrow corridor. Voices shouted commands, and the smell of dust filled the air. A figure stepped out from a room at the end. Not in panic, not in fear, just slow movement, steady eyes, and a face that looked tired, almost bored. His posture didn't change even with armed men screaming orders. It was as though he had expected this morning to come eventually, as though he'd been living with it like a shadow that never left. He raised his hands, not trembling, not confused, not fighting back. Instead, there was a look on his face that no one expected relief. Something inside him seemed to let go, like a tension he'd secretly enjoyed holding on to for years. A man who shouldn't have been proud of anything suddenly carried himself like someone who had waited long enough. Before we continue with this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. Officers shouted for him to get on the floor, hands behind his back. The man obeyed, slow and controlled, like someone settling into a familiar routine. His knees touched the wood, hands pulled behind him, cuffs clicked shut with the certainty of a long-delayed ending. Yet nothing about him looked cornered or frightened. No shaking hands. No pleading questions. Instead, there was a calmness that felt wrong in a moment meant to break a person. His gray hair, still thick, fell over one eyebrow as he bowed his head for a second, almost like someone offering thanks. The lines around his mouth weren't shaped by worry. They curved faintly upward, as though he had been holding back a smile and finally allowed it to surface. His eyes, a faded hazel, lifted toward the nearest officer. The gaze wasn't angry or confused, it was satisfied. Quick confession before we go on. My wife said I won't hit 1,000 subscribers before Saturday on this channel. She even laughed. Laughed. Please, don't let her have this victory. Hit that subscribe button so I can walk into the living room like a champion. The officer holding his arm tightened his grip, assuming the man was mocking them. But the expression wasn't mockery. It was something far more disturbing. Peace. A quiet man, who had carried a secret for decades, now looked like someone delivering a confession without saying a word. The officer leaned close to secure the cuffs. The man whispered, voice low, almost gentle, as if speaking to an old friend who finally arrived. Those words were the kind that leave chills long after they're spoken. It took you a long time. Not shouted, not resentful, just honest. The kind of honesty that feels like a punch, because it means he knew this day would come. He had counted on it. He had waited for it. He had lived his life knowing justice would eventually remember him, and he welcomed it. The room went silent. Even the officers froze for a moment, unsure whether they had captured a criminal or completed a story he believed could never end without them. Neighbors watched from their porches as the patrol cars lined up like a wall around the house. Some held coffee mugs halfway to their lips, frozen in disbelief. One woman in a robe tightened her arms around herself, trying to remember if she had ever spoken more than a few words to the quiet man in that house. Another neighbor, suddenly pale, thought back to how he used to wave every morning on his way to work. Polite, quiet, never unusual. That was the story everyone told themselves. He was just another man living an ordinary life. He mowed his lawn, He worked on his old pickup truck every few weekends. He paid his bills on time. No loud parties. No arguments. No visitors who stayed long enough to raise suspicion. Even his groceries were simple, predictable cans, dry food, nothing personal. His life looked like a checklist of someone who wanted no attention. A ghost hiding in plain sight. Not hiding out of fear, but out of patience. The arresting officers led him outside, and the neighbors leaned forward to see. The man didn't hang his head. He didn't stare at the ground like someone caught in shame. Instead, his eyes calmly scanned the street, as if he were greeting old friends after years away. A few neighbors nodded back out of instinct, then snapped their heads down. Realizing it felt wrong to acknowledge him at all, someone whispered, "Did he do something that serious?" Another replied, "He never looked like the type." The comment echoed what countless people think until a truth explodes into their quiet lives. Evil doesn't wear a costume. It doesn't broadcast itself. Sometimes it gets up early, goes to work, and waters the lawn. Sometimes it waves hello like everyone else. The man didn't need to hide. Ordinary life hid him perfectly. Officers guided him toward the patrol car, but his expression remained the same. Calm smirk. A look that seemed to belong to someone who believed they were part of history, instead of a crime. No fear, no fight, just patience rewarded. The cuffs dug into his wrists, yet he lifted his chin with a strange dignity, like he had waited for someone to finally write the last chapter of a story only he knew. The questions erupted everywhere, whispered by the neighbors, murmured by officers who pretended not to care, even echoed silently through the reporters arriving late enough to miss the moment he spoke those haunting words. People wanted to know, what crime could make a man wait 46 years without regret? What act could sit inside a person so comfortably that they could mow lawns, smile at children passing by, shop at the local market, and sleep peacefully every night? The patrol car door opened. He paused, glancing one last time at the home he had lived in longer than most marriages survive. Then he looked toward the officer beside him, and for a second, that faint smile returned. Not proud, not taunting, just satisfied. As if he believed justice had finally caught up. Not because it was clever, but because he had allowed it. What kind of person carries a crime for decades and still greets the world like a decent neighbor? What kind of man waits for the knock on the door like someone expecting a guest, welcoming them with relief instead of terror? Here's the real question that should unsettle anyone watching. How does someone stay hidden? Not by running, but by blending in so perfectly that no one ever thinks to look at them. If someone like this lived on your street for years, would you even know? Subscribe so you never stay unaware. Southfield, Michigan in 1977 was the kind of place people bragged about. Neighbors didn't just wave from a distance. They stood on porches, shared jokes across driveways, and offered help without being asked. Kids left bikes on lawns without a lock, and front doors stayed open long enough for the cold air to creep in while families carried groceries inside. Crime existed in other places, big cities, troubled towns, distant headlines, but not here. Not on these snow-dusted streets where holiday decorations glowed warmly against the early winter skies. It was the type of community that made people relax their shoulders without even realizing it. Parents let children walk to the corner store alone. Teenagers hung out after school near the librarian parks without an ounce of worry. Even the police patrol cars seemed to coast without urgency, moving slowly through neighborhoods as if they were simply checking on old friends. No one expected danger, because they had never been forced to learn how to see it. This blind comfort wrapped the town like a blanket, making everyone certain they already understood their world. They trusted it. They trusted each other. They believed bad news belonged somewhere else. The quiet streets, the holiday carols playing from shop radios, the soft glow in every window, these things made the people of Southfield feel untouchable, safe, protected from anything cruel or unexplained. That confidence became their shield. But it was also the easiest thing to break. In a place so convinced it was protected, a single unpredictable act didn't just harm a victim, it shook the identity of an entire community. They weren't prepared for fear. They didn't even know how to recognize it, and when danger finally showed up on December nights like this one, Southfield had no warning signs left to read. Edna Johnson wasn't loud. She didn't demand attention. Yet, in a town like Southfield, she had a presence that was impossible to ignore. As a librarian at the local branch, she was the anchor for children discovering their first stories, for students chasing facts for homework, and for adults seeking a quiet moment away from the world. She carried warmth in her smile, and patience in her voice, qualities that made everyone feel seen, valued, and understood. She knew her neighbors by name, remembered birthdays, and even recalled small details about people they themselves had forgotten. To the kids in the neighborhood, she was the storyteller who could make dragons and detectives feel real. To her colleagues, she was the calm in every storm, the steady hand that ensured the library ran smoothly, even during the busiest afternoons. Her life was simple, quiet, predictable, and in its simplicity, it was profoundly trusted. Everyone felt they knew Edna. She wasn't flashy. She didn't seek attention. But that made her presence more comforting, more real. People didn't look at her and see just another resident. They saw someone who embodied the safety and integrity of their community. She was the reason Southfield felt alive but protected, a living symbol of normalcy, of the kind of goodness that made danger seem unthinkable. On the evening of December 9th, 1977, she prepared for a night she had looked forward to for weeks. She slipped into her blue coat, the one she loved, for its warmth and gentle color, unaware that it would become the last piece of her in the world as she knew it. A coat that would be remembered not just for its hue, but as a symbol of innocence interrupted, a life snatched from a community that trusted too easily. The blue coat wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was Edna's favorite, soft and warm, hugging her shoulders as she stepped out into the December chill. To those who knew her, the coat was part of her identity, calm, approachable, ordinary in all the right ways. That night, as she locked her door and waved to her neighbor, it gleamed softly under the dim streetlights, a quiet marker of her presence in a world that would soon turn cruelly chaotic. Neighbors remember small things when tragedy strikes, and for many, it was that coat that lingered in their minds first. They recall the color, the texture, the way it moved with her as she walked. It was an ordinary detail that became extraordinary, a beacon of someone taken too soon. That blue coat would later appear in news reports, in posters, in photographs revisited by detectives decades later. It was a reminder of who she was, not just what happened. In a place where danger was unimaginable, the coat symbolized the normal life she carried for everyone else. People saw her wearing it and felt a sense of calm. She's out there, safe, returning soon. They didn't know that such an ordinary thing could become a haunting emblem of loss. Even now, the blue coat is more than clothing in memory. It represents the fragility of trust, the vulnerability of innocence, and the sharp contrast between the safety Southfield residents believed in and the violence that would invade it. A simple garment, a gentle color, and yet it holds the weight of a story that would forever change the way this town remembers the night Edna Johnson vanished. Southfield had never forced its residents to question their safety. Streets were quiet, houses lined neatly, and families trusted that the people around them were the people they seemed to be. The night Edna Johnson left her home, the town felt ordinary, familiar, almost comforting. No one suspected that a single walk across a few blocks could lead to a disappearance that would shake every assumption they held about security, trust, and innocence. Edna herself moved through this comfort without thought. She smiled at neighbors she passed, nodded politely, and wrapped her blue coat tightly against the December cold. Every step she took was routine, normal, yet the very ordinariness of it made the darkness that awaited her all the more terrifying. In a town where people left doors unlocked, where children played outside without fear, the idea that danger could appear without warning was almost incomprehensible. For decades, this sense of false security defined Southfield. People clung to it, believing their lives were insulated by familiarity. They believed that the world they saw through frosted windows and quiet streets was the world that existed safe, predictable, untouched by cruelty. And yet, the events of that night would expose how fragile that belief truly was. Have you ever trusted your neighborhood so much that danger felt impossible? That question lingers not just in Southfield, but wherever communities think safety is guaranteed. It is a question that challenges complacency, forces reflection, and reminds us that trust, while necessary, must coexist with awareness. It was 7:15 p.m. on a crisp December evening, when Edna Johnson finished locking the door of her small, well-kept bungalow. The keys clicked into place, the latch fell, and she exhaled without thought. From her porch, Alistair Finch, her neighbor, looked up and gave her a casual nod. She returned it with a bright, friendly smile, the kind that could light a dreary winter night. For anyone watching from the street, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She tucked her scarf around her neck, pulled the blue coat tighter against the cold, and stepped lightly onto the sidewalk. The world carried on around her. Cars passed quietly on the snow-dusted street. Distant laughter drifted from homes preparing for the holidays, and lights glowed warmly in the windows of neighbors. A normal night. A safe night. One that would never feel normal again. In that moment, Edna's life was ordinary in every sense. There were no alarms, no warnings, no hints that this routine step, locking the door and walking down the block, would mark the last time she would move freely through her neighborhood. Her gestures, her smile, the simple nod to her neighbor, these were small acts of trust, of connection, of life uninterrupted. Yet, the normalcy was fragile. Every movement, every step, seemed innocent. But history has a way of twisting the ordinary into a stage for tragedy. That evening, nothing betrayed the danger that would soon emerge from nowhere, changing the community's understanding of safety and leaving a void that would echo for decades. Edna's steps carried more than just her through the quiet streets of Southfield. They carried anticipation. She was headed to her best friend's holiday party, a gathering she had been looking forward to for weeks. The thought of laughter, music, and familiar faces lifted her spirits. Every detail of the evening had been planned in her mind. The warmth of the living room, the aroma of spiced cookies, the shared jokes that only friends who truly knew each other could appreciate. Her excitement wasn't loud or boisterous. It was subtle, threaded into the rhythm of her movements. The way her fingers brushed against the buttons of her coat, the slight bounce in her step as she approached the next block. It was the contentment of someone who felt connected, safe, and part of a community she cherished. That evening was meant to be a simple celebration, a pause from life's usual demands, a night to feel joy without concern. To neighbors watching from windows, she seemed exactly as she always did, kind, thoughtful, approachable. Nothing suggested that her walk to a house only 3 blocks away would become the last anyone would see her alive. In fact, her joy made the streets feel even safer, as if the presence of someone so trusted and ordinary confirmed the neighborhood's quiet charm. But that excitement, that routine happiness, was also what would make her absence feel unbearable. What began as a walk toward celebration would soon transform into a timeline shrouded in fear and confusion, a stretch of hours that would haunt the town and her loved ones forever. The ordinary evening was slipping into the unknown, and no one had yet noticed the first cracks in the illusion of safety. By 8 p.m., Edna had vanished from view, though no one yet realized it. The streets remained quiet, the snow lightly crunching under the few remaining footsteps, and the glow from windows continued to suggest life, warmth, and safety. Yet somewhere between her door and the house 3 blocks away, Edna's presence evaporated like breath in the winter air. No scream, no struggle, no visible warning, just absence. Her neighbor, who had waved only moments ago, turned back to his own home after a few minutes, assuming she was on schedule and moving swiftly along the block. Others were inside their houses, drawn to dinners, television shows, and holiday preparations, unaware that something had already shifted in their carefully ordered world. The ordinary rhythms of life, the laughter from kitchens, the closing of doors, the distant hum of streetlights continued as if nothing had changed, masking a growing void no one could yet name. For her family and friends, That night began to stretch unnervingly long. Calls went unanswered. The route she normally took, the timing she always followed, became points of worry. The sense of normal life, the safety, predictability, and comfort that had defined Southfield was slipping. Every ordinary detail of the neighborhood became a backdrop for anxiety. What once felt familiar now felt incomplete. Edna's absence transformed the town's perception in an instant. The streets that had offered trust now echoed with the possibility of threat. The windows that glowed warmly now seemed to reflect a collective dread. A routine evening had turned into a mystery. A night that began with laughter and excitement and now contained questions too heavy to ignore. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. It's even crazier than this one. By 10 p.m., Prudence Owens, Edna's best friend, was fraying at the edges of panic. She had expected Edna to arrive hours earlier, and when the door remained closed, the apartment silent, a tight knot formed in her chest. She dialed the Southfield Police Department, her fingers trembling, her voice sharp with urgency. "She's missing. She hasn't arrived. Something's wrong," she explained, trying to convey the gravity she felt. The response she received, however, was maddening in its casual dismissal. "Give it a night. She's probably just with a friend," the officer said, as if logic alone could dissolve the fear clawing through her. Prudence knew Edna, knew the habits and predictability that had defined her life. This was not a woman to vanish without notice, especially not on a night she had looked forward to for weeks. Every minute stretched like hours. Prudence imagined Edna walking, alone, unaware of danger, or worse, trapped in a situation she could not control. The imagined scenarios churned in her mind, each more horrifying than the last. The warmth of the holiday party, the simple happiness Edna had carried, felt suddenly unreachable. Meanwhile, the police's lack of urgency meant precious time slipped through the fingers of a community that had only moments ago felt untouchable. Southfield's quiet streets, once a symbol of comfort and trust, now seemed eerily indifferent to the crisis unfolding within them. This was the moment where normal life ended, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The familiar streets, neighbors, and routines offered no answers. Edna had disappeared, and the clock moved relentlessly forward, leaving only questions, panic, and a sense that something terrible had occurred between 7:15 p.m. and the late hours of the night. By the time the night deepened, Edna Johnson had vanished without a trace. The hours between 7:15 p.m. and 10 p.m. stretched like an impossible chasm, a timeline filled with questions that no one could yet answer. What had happened in those few short hours? How could a woman, familiar to everyone, simply disappear from a street she had walked countless times? The next discovery would ignite fear and disbelief. 2 days later, a small Ford Pinto was found miles from Southfield, tucked into a forgotten access road off Telegraph. The vehicle's worn exterior and abandoned interior told a story of interruption. Ordinary life, frozen, halted, and left behind. Edna's belongings remained untouched, her purse and keys resting innocently on the passenger seat. No signs of struggle, no robbery, just absence, glaring in the stark silence of the winter woods. The discovery created a void that no logical explanation could fill. How did a woman vanish so completely, leaving behind only an empty car and the unanswered questions of her loved ones? Every step she had taken that night seemed lost to the darkness. Every familiar route she had walked now haunted with suspicion. The community, once confident in the safety of their streets, felt the sudden collapse of trust. Every neighbor's glance, every familiar corner, now carried a twinge of uncertainty. Who could commit such an act without leaving a trace? How could someone penetrate a quiet neighborhood and remain invisible in plain sight? If a loved one vanished like this, what would be your first move? Comment below. The missing Pinto became the first tangible clue, a symbol of normal life interrupted, and a chilling pivot point where comfort met horror. Southfield had been shaken, its residents confronted with the terrifying realization that even the most ordinary evenings could harbor extraordinary tragedy. 2 days after Edna Johnson disappeared, the first tangible sign that something horrific had occurred emerged. A small, well-worn Ford Pinto was discovered miles from Southfield, tucked into a neglected access road off Telegraph Road. Its placement was almost casual, as if someone wanted it hidden but not too carefully, a vehicle abandoned, yet not destroyed. The car sat quietly among overgrown weeds, its presence a stark contrast to the orderly streets Edna had last been seen on. Inside, everything seemed ordinary. The seats were intact, the dashboard untouched. Edna's purse rested on the passenger seat, her wallet and keys still inside. No signs of struggle marred the interior, and the car's exterior bore only the marks of time and weather. For the police, this scene posed an immediate puzzle. The absence of violence didn't make sense in a world where abductions often left clear evidence. Yet, the car had become a silent witness, hinting that something deliberate had occurred. Neighbors and onlookers were struck by the normalcy of the abandoned vehicle. It was familiar enough to belong, out of place enough to alarm. Its quiet presence suggested that the act behind Edna's disappearance was calculated, controlled, and intentional. The simplicity of the scene, the untouched belongings, the stationary car spoke volumes. The absence of chaos revealed more about the perpetrator than any confession ever could. Someone who understood how to leave little behind, who could disrupt a life without leaving obvious traces. This Ford Pinto, humble and unassuming, became the first clue that the disappearance was not random. It carried the weight of unanswered questions, a tangible reminder of Edna Johnson's sudden, unexplained absence, and a warning that ordinary appearances could mask extraordinary evil. The absence of physical harm inside the Pinto was unsettling. No broken glass, no overturned seats, no bloodstains beyond the tiniest trace, undetectable with 1977 technology. Edna's purse and keys remained exactly where she had left them. Nothing had been stolen. The scene offered no immediate clues, yet the lack of violence spoke more sharply than any wound ever could. It suggested intention, precision, and a cruel understanding of how to remove someone from the world without leaving a scream behind. Sometimes, criminals communicate through omission. Leaving a scene clean is a method of control, a way of asserting dominance without drawing attention to the act itself. By taking nothing, the perpetrator erased obvious motives, forcing investigators to look deeper into the why rather than the what. In this case, the untouched belongings symbolized a truth too stark to ignore. Edna's disappearance was not about robbery or petty gain. The act existed purely to remove her from life, leaving her absence as the only evidence. The scene, quiet and ordinary to a casual observer, became a statement. Whoever had committed this act understood subtlety. They did not need force to announce themselves. They relied on the shock of disappearance and the calmness of normalcy to mask the horror of their crime. The Pinto, parked in obscurity, carried this unspoken declaration. For investigators, the clean interior was both frustrating and enlightening. It eliminated common suspects tied to theft and refocused the case on a calculated abduction. In a town where crime had always been measured in petty thefts or minor vandalism, the lack of obvious violence signaled a departure from the expected. A chilling reminder that danger could arrive silently, leaving only questions, fear, and absence in its wake. Among the sparse evidence left behind, two small details became the silent witnesses to Edna Johnson's disappearance. A partial fingerprint on the exterior of the driver's side door, smudged by winter air, and a nearly invisible speck of blood on the floor mat. In 1977, these traces were almost meaningless. The fingerprint was too faint for comparison against paper records, the microscopic blood sample too small for the coroner to type or analyze. Technology had not yet caught up to the crime. Yet these small traces carried weight. They hinted at the presence of another person, someone whose existence had been invisible to neighbors, unnoticed by the casual passerby, and ignored by the first responders. They were subtle, almost hidden, but they confirmed what intuition already whispered. Edna's absence was not an accident. The fingerprint and blood offered a window into the careful nature of the act. The perpetrator had not left the chaos typical of a confrontation. No screams, no struggle, only these tiny reminders that someone had been there, and that someone had acted with purpose. Sometimes, absence is itself a signature, and here it was amplified by what little remained. Investigators could only log the items, placing them carefully in evidence bags, aware that their potential would remain unrealized for decades. Those tiny traces would become the key to justice in a later era, when forensic science would advance enough to read the silent story they carried. The invisible fingerprints of this crime waited patiently for time, for technology, for the relentless pursuit of truth. The Pinto had been a quiet witness, leaving behind more questions than answers. Every unbroken seat, every untouched belonging, and those minute traces whispered of a calculated act designed to evade immediate detection. Absence had become the loudest evidence of all. In 1977, the tools to fully understand what had happened to Edna Johnson simply did not exist. DNA testing was in its infancy. Fingerprints could only be compared manually against paper records, and microscopic traces of blood were often too small to analyze. The investigators had limited options, relying on witness statements, basic forensics, and circumstantial evidence. Every lead that might have unraveled the mystery decades later remained tantalizingly out of reach. The Ford Pinto, its untouched interior and cryptic traces, became a symbol of the limitations of the time. The case file, filled with handwritten notes and photographs, represented all that could be recorded but not yet solved. Each photograph captured a frozen moment, every page a testament to effort constrained by technology. In many ways, the tools themselves were a barrier between justice and closure, leaving the town and Edna's family suspended in a painful limbo. The partial fingerprint and microscopic blood, collected carefully but without the ability to fully process, were reminders of the era's blind spots. Investigators could log their presence, store them in evidence bags, and hope that someday, science would catch up. But for the people waiting, for the family left in quiet anguish, the limitations felt like inaction. Time itself became an obstacle, stretching decades of grief into a nearly unbearable weight. Southfield streets remained calm on the surface, but the absence of answers cast a shadow over the community. The small details left behind in that Pinto hinted at what was possible with patience and advancement. Yet, in 1977, they were mostly questions without answers, a chilling reminder that even when a crime is witnessed, the tools to understand it may not yet exist. The stage was set for decades of uncertainty, where absence became the loudest evidence, and a small town waited unknowingly for the moment technology would finally illuminate the truth. In 1977, the Southfield Police Department faced a challenge that went beyond the disappearance itself. Investigators had only rudimentary tools, handwritten reports, carbon copy interview notes, and the occasional fingerprint card. Photographs were black and white, capturing shapes and shadows without offering detailed clarity. Forensic technology had not yet entered the realm of DNA, and even microscopic evidence could provide little more than a confirmation that something had occurred. Detectives were forced to rely heavily on witness accounts, hoping memories would hold up against time and stress. Every observation was recorded, cross-referenced, and cataloged manually. Without automated systems, connecting dots often depended on luck, persistence, and human error. Hours were spent comparing cards, notes, and photographs, yet the true significance of the clues often went unrecognized. We're on a mission to hit 1,000 subscribers before Friday. If you're watching this, you can help us get there. Just tap the subscribe button, it's free. Even the most diligent officers were constrained by the era. The partial fingerprint on Edna's car, the faint blood trace, and the unusual placement of her abandoned car, all the small details that might have led to a breakthrough, were nearly useless without modern processing techniques. The tools simply could not interpret the subtle story these traces told. Investigators could observe, they could speculate, but they could not verify or match these silent clues to a suspect. The frustration was compounded by a societal expectation that crimes could be solved quickly with direct evidence. Abductions without obvious motives or visible struggle were rare and challenging. Without technology capable of analyzing the evidence fully, the case teetered on a thin edge between active pursuit and helpless stagnation. Southfield's sense of safety remained, superficially, intact, but the limitations of the time ensured that the full truth of Edna Johnson's disappearance would remain just out of reach. The partial fingerprint on Edna's Ford Pinto and the nearly invisible blood speck on the driver's side floor mat became mute witnesses to a crime that had no voice in 1977. Collected carefully and stored in evidence bags, they offered tantalizing hints of a presence, yet lacked the means to speak clearly. The fingerprint was smudged, incomplete, and nearly impossible to compare without digital assistance, while the tiny blood trace was too small to analyze, only confirming that someone other than Edna had been in the vehicle. To the investigators at the time, these silent clues were frustratingly unhelpful. They could document their existence, make note of them in files, and hope for luck or new leads. But without advanced technology, these details could not be linked to a person. They were frozen in a limbo, caught between the reality of the crime and the limits of the tools available. Despite their muteness, these traces were vital. They carried the unmistakable mark of another human being, someone who had passed through the Pinto, yet left almost nothing behind. The absence of destruction or theft highlighted intention. The perpetrator had left deliberate traces, almost as if mocking investigators, offering clues just beyond the reach of contemporary methods. These clues became the silent backbone of a case that would eventually awaken decades later. They waited patiently in evidence bags, untouched by the limitations of 1977, until a future where science could finally give them a voice. The mute clues underscored the cruel irony of the era. A crime had been committed, evidence existed, but the tools to interpret it were unavailable. The Ford Pinto was a frozen tableau, and within it, the fingerprint and blood whispered a story no one could hear yet. In the early days of the investigation, police cast a wide net, but the direction they chose often missed the mark. Attention centered on acquaintances, recent dates, or transient individuals passing through town, familiar suspects whose proximity made them convenient targets. Each interview, each cross-reference, consumed time and energy, yet none revealed the truth. The real perpetrator remained invisible, quietly slipping through the cracks of assumptions and bias. Detectives followed leads that seemed logical on the surface. A disgruntled acquaintance was questioned for hours. A passing stranger's alibi was examined in painstaking detail. All of it led to dead ends. Meanwhile, the clues left in the Pinto fingerprint and blood were almost ignored, too small and ambiguous for the investigative methods of the time. The mismatch between the evidence and the suspects they pursued created a widening gap between reality and the investigation. This misdirection had consequences beyond frustration. Precious time passed without tangible progress. The community, initially vigilant and involved, began to lose hope. Every wrong lead subtly shifted attention away from the true perpetrator, allowing him to remain hidden. The act itself, already carefully executed, was reinforced by investigative blind spots, creating a cruel symmetry between planning and oversight. Despite their efforts, investigators couldn't account for one key factor: the killer's ability to blend in. He was ordinary, unremarkable, and unknown to the people around him. This combination of human error, limited tools, and an unassuming criminal created a perfect storm of delay. The investigation, guided by logic constrained by the era, was inadvertently chasing shadows while the truth lingered just beyond reach. The misdirected focus left the town in uncertainty, the family in growing despair, and the evidence boxed in silence. The real story waited, patient, until the era of modern forensics would arrive. As weeks passed, Edna Johnson's smiling face began to fade not from memory, but literally, from the paper of missing person posters tacked to telephone poles and bulletin boards. The harsh Michigan winter peeled corners, blurred ink, and left behind curling edges that mirrored the town's own fraying sense of security. The posters, once urgent and vibrant, became fragile reminders of absence, their message softened by time but never erased. For her family, the fading images were a cruel symbol. Every day brought the same ache, the same unanswered question. Where was Edna? The quiet streets of Southfield, once comforting in their routine, now carried an undercurrent of worry. Every shadow, every sound in the night could be imagined as danger. Neighbors whispered, children were kept closer to home, and the community's sense of safety was quietly eroding. The posters themselves became a visual testament to hope fading into despair. They chronicled not only Edna's disappearance but also the limits of a community's ability to protect its own. People walked past the curled edges without thinking, not realizing that each torn corner represented years of unanswered questions, each smudge a small echo of unresolved fear. For law enforcement, the fading posters mirrored the case itself. Public attention waned, tips slowed, and leads grew colder. The more visible signs of urgency disappeared, the more the investigation struggled against its own inertia. Even the initial shock of the missing librarian softened, replaced by resignation. And yet, in the silence of fading paper and whispered concern, the story remained. The memory of Edna Johnson, the fear she left behind, and the questions her absence inspired lingered. The town had not forgotten, only waited, helpless, for the day when the truth might finally speak. As the initial urgency faded, the investigation into Edna Johnson's disappearance slowed to a crawl. The limited evidence photographs, handwritten notes, the smudged fingerprint, the tiny blood trace, was carefully filed and placed into a cardboard box labeled Johnson. It was tucked away in the precinct's archive vault, a silent monument to a case that had stubbornly resisted resolution. The box, like the case itself, seemed forgotten to most, yet it held the quiet hope of eventual discovery. For the police, the limitations of 1,977 meant that many avenues had closed before they could even be fully explored. Leads dried up, witness memories faded, and the public's attention shifted elsewhere. The box became both literal and symbolic. Evidence set aside, potential insight paused, and a story waiting patiently for time and technology to catch up. Within that small container lay the proof that the crime had occurred, the clues that one day would reopen the case, and the silent frustration of generations of investigators constrained by tools that could not yet speak. The act itself, calculated, precise, and almost invisible, was mirrored by the quiet dormancy of the case file. It waited, boxed and inert, yet potent, ready for the day when someone would finally have the means to read it. For Edna's family and the Southfield community, the box was unknowable, yet its existence represented a lingering question that refused to fade entirely. Time did not erase absence. It only made waiting more unbearable. Years passed, with nothing but the hollow echo of what had been lost. And so the case rested, dormant but unresolved, forgotten by many, remembered by a few. It held the invisible promise that truth has a way of resurfacing sometimes decades later, when the world is finally ready to listen. Every year, on December 9th, Franklin Johnson would drive quietly to the clearing near Telegraph Road, where his sister's Ford Pinto had been found decades earlier. In his hands, he carried a single blue rose, a fragile, living tribute to Edna, whose absence had defined his life. The ritual was private, silent, yet deeply expressive. Each year, he knelt, placing the flower in the snow or the dirt, whispering words only he could hear. The blue rose, rare and unnatural in color, mirrored the unnatural absence that had haunted Franklin for so long. It was a symbol of devotion, memory, and the refusal to allow his sister to fade entirely from the world. As the seasons changed, as snow melted into spring and autumn leaves fell, Franklin returned, unchanged in his purpose. The ritual became a rhythm of grief, a personal testament to the enduring weight of loss that cannot be measured in days or months. To the casual observer, it might have seemed a small act, almost ceremonial in its simplicity. But for Franklin, it was survival. The act of remembrance, performed meticulously each year, was his way of keeping Edna present, of holding on to the fragment of family that had been torn away. No official investigation could replace the loss, and no passage of time could heal the gnawing uncertainty that lingered in his heart. This ritual, repeated for 46 years, became a private chronicle of grief, one that did not age with the years. It served as a constant reminder that absence leaves a mark, not just on places or possessions, but on the very fabric of the living, an echo that lingers long after the world has moved on. Grief, in Franklin's world, did not follow the natural passage of time. 46 years had passed, yet each December 9th felt as raw and urgent as the first. The absence of his sister was a wound that refused to close, a hollow that remained unfilled by anything else in life. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary day carried the weight of a question with no answer. Where was Edna? For Franklin, the years did not soften the pain, they crystallized it. Each season's change was a reminder that life had continued without resolution, that the world moved on, while his sister's fate remained suspended. Friends and neighbors, long since accustomed to the story of the missing librarian, could no longer feel the immediate tension. But Franklin carried it daily. The passage of time had not dimmed the fear, the longing, or the anger at a justice delayed for nearly half a century. This unending grief shaped his life in subtle and profound ways. Decisions were weighed with her absence in mind. Quiet moments were spent reflecting on what could have been, and each day was a reminder of the fragility of safety, trust, and normalcy. The pain of a loved one gone without explanation is uniquely torturous. It is a slow, persistent shadow that never allows the heart to settle. The story of Franklin's grief is one of resilience and unwavering memory. It is a testament to the human spirit's need for closure and the psychological toll of unresolved loss. Every blue rose left at Telegraph Road was not merely a gesture, it was a protest against the silence, a refusal to allow memory to be erased by time or neglect. Should every cold case automatically be reopened after 20 years? Share your take. The absence of answers is a unique form of cruelty. For Franklin Johnson, every unanswered question about his sister's disappearance was a silent tormentor, gnawing at the edges of daily life. Each passing year layered uncertainty upon grief, a relentless reminder that the world had no explanation, no closure, and no justice for Edna. The mind, left to speculate, invents possibilities, each one more painful than the last. Friends and neighbors could offer condolences, but no words could pierce the void of an unsolved case. The lack of resolution transforms mourning into a daily exercise in frustration and vigilance. Every sound outside the window, every stranger passing by, became a potential threat or a trigger, and every mundane object in the home doors, windows, keys, served as reminders of vulnerability. The mind replays the final known moments endlessly, each replay sharpening the emotional pain. In the broader sense, the unresolved disappearance inflicted a shadow over the family that no time could erase. Ordinary life continued externally, but internally, there was a constant tension, a watchfulness born of fear and hope. The grief was compounded by helplessness, the knowledge that, despite all efforts, the truth remained out of reach. Every holiday season, every birthday, every anniversary of her disappearance reinforced the same bitter reality. Answers were absent, and the world had moved forward without her. The toll of unanswered questions does more than affect memory. It shapes behavior, choices, and relationships. Franklin's ritual of the blue rose was more than remembrance. It was an act of defiance, a way to preserve Edna's presence and honor her existence in a world that had largely forgotten her. The weight of uncertainty carried by one man mirrors the emotional cost endured by countless families caught in the drag of cold cases left unresolved. For the Johnson family and the Southfield community, the passage of decades brought no answers, only a growing sense of suspended reality. Friends, neighbors, and even local authorities lived alongside the invisible weight of the unresolved disappearance. Life moved forward, yet the memory of Edna lingered, an unspoken presence in conversations, in holidays, in streets that once felt safe. The town had learned to live with absence, but absence does not lessen its impact. Family gatherings were shadowed by what could not be said, by the unhealed gap left by a loved one's sudden departure. Franklin carried this burden alone, a solitary witness to decades of unresolved fear and sorrow. Each year's anniversary became both a marker of loss and a reminder of institutional failure. While the community slowly returned to routine, he remained locked in a silent dialogue with the past, maintaining the ritual of the blue rose and preserving the memory that most had set aside. The limbo stretched beyond grief. It was a constant negotiation between hope and despair, between the expectation of closure and the reality of stagnation. Each passing year intensified the emotional pressure, leaving a trail of quiet anguish through the family and community. The inability to act, to know, or to resolve left an invisible scar that time could not erase. This waiting is a story repeated in countless towns, a painful reminder that unresolved disappearances are more than statistics. They are enduring emotional prisons for those left behind. The community's everyday life carried on. But for Franklin, the empty chair at the table, the quiet streets, and the blue rose were constant witnesses to a past that refused to let go. Detective Elias Vance was not an investigator of the 1970 seconds. He belonged to a new era. A man in his early 40s, calm but relentless, he carried the reputation of someone who refused to let cases die quietly in a file cabinet. Where past detectives had been limited by tools and technology, Vance wielded the full arsenal of modern forensic science. For him, cold cases were not abandoned, they were puzzles, waiting for the right key. Assigned to the Johnson case in 2019, Vance approached it with both caution and determination. He did not see the faded photographs, brittle notes, or frozen evidence as static relics. He saw potential, waiting to be unlocked. Every paper, every photo, every item in that cardboard box held a fragment of truth, and Vance was determined to make it speak. The decades of inaction were irrelevant. This was his opportunity to bring resolution where time had previously failed. What set Vance apart was his combination of patience and technological fluency. Unlike his predecessors, he could turn near-invisible blood traces into partial DNA profiles and blurry fingerprints into data ready for digital comparison. The constraints that once made the Johnson case impenetrable no longer applied. With the tools of the 21st century, the ghost of Edna Johnson's disappearance could finally leave a trail. As Vance began examining the evidence, he felt a familiar tension. Excitement mingled with the weight of decades of loss. Every scrap of data could be the thread that pulled the entire case together. He knew the responsibility. This was not only a matter of solving a crime, but of restoring justice to a family who had lived with silence for nearly half a century. The evidence collected in 1977 had seemed almost impotent at the time. A smudged fingerprint on a car door, a microscopic blood trace on the floor mat, clues that had once whispered without consequence. For decades, they lay dormant, unable to speak under the limitations of 20th century forensics. But in 2019, technology offered a second chance, transforming these old, fragile remnants into powerful instruments of justice. Detective Vance approached each piece with the precision of a surgeon and the vision of a detective unbound by the past. The fingerprint, once deemed indecipherable, was scanned, enhanced, and digitized. Software algorithms mapped ridges and minutiae, revealing patterns that human eyes had failed to catch. Meanwhile, the tiny blood sample, almost invisible to the coroner decades ago, was subjected to STR analysis, extracting a partial DNA profile. These modern tools allowed evidence to finally speak in a language that could no longer be ignored. The process was painstaking, demanding patience, skill, and an unwavering focus. Every digital enhancement, every profile comparison, carried the weight of decades of unanswered questions. Each breakthrough, no matter how small, ignited hope not only for solving a crime but for offering long-delayed closure to a grieving family. What had been invisible was now visible. What had been silent now had a voice. Detective Vance understood the stakes. The slightest error could derail decades of effort. Yet the potential reward, a name, a lead, a connection, was enormous. With each analysis, the case shifted from a historical artifact to an active investigation, The old ghost of Edna Johnson's disappearance beginning to take form in the hands of modern science. The automated fingerprint identification system, or AFIS, transformed the landscape of criminal investigation. For Detective Vance, it meant that the smudged, partial fingerprint on Edna Johnson's car could now be compared against millions of prints with incredible speed and precision. Patterns invisible to the naked eye became quantifiable data points, giving shape to what had been a ghostly trace for more than 40 years. At the same time, the microscopic blood speck, nearly dismissed by the 1977 coroner, underwent STR, short tandem repeat analysis. This technology could extract genetic sequences from even the smallest cellular material, producing a DNA profile capable of linking a person to the crime scene. Where past investigators could only speculate, modern science provided hard, irrefutable evidence. Vance understood the magnitude of these breakthroughs. A single match in AFIS could identify a suspect in minutes. A DNA match could confirm guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The tools that now rested in his hands were decades ahead of the original investigators, able to illuminate details that had once been invisible and untestable. Every comparison carried tension. Was this the breakthrough that would finally provide the name they had been searching for? As the fingerprint data and DNA profiles were run, Vance felt the anticipation of decades converging into this moment. These silent clues, long ignored, were now active participants in the hunt for justice. With AFIS and STR analysis, the Johnson case shifted from a cold file to a living investigation. The partial fingerprint and blood, previously mute witnesses, were about to reveal a startling connection. Modern technology had become the bridge between past failure and present opportunity, giving voice to evidence that had waited far too long to speak. The moment Detective Vance compared the enhanced fingerprint to the database, a chill ran through him. This was no ordinary match. This was the fingerprint of a man who had been invisible for 46 years, untouched by law enforcement, untouched by suspicion. The smudged print that once seemed meaningless now carried a name, or at least a genetic signature, a trail waiting to be followed. Then came the blood analysis. The STR results confirmed what the fingerprint suggested. Both the blood and the print belonged to the same individual. The implication was staggering. For nearly half a century, this person had lived among others without detection, leaving behind only a faint trace of their crime. Technology had revealed what killers pray to hide, and the revelation was electrifying in its clarity and precision. Detective Vance felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. The case was no longer a shadow. It was concrete, actionable, and terrifyingly close to resolution. This man, unknown to the 1,977 investigators, was now identified as a single genetic entity. A phantom, no more. Every lead, every investigative effort moving forward, could now be focused, laser-sharp, based on the undeniable evidence provided by modern science. The community, the family, and the detectives themselves were on the edge of a breakthrough that had once seemed impossible. Decades of silence, decades of unanswered questions, were beginning to give way to the first clear steps toward justice. The phantom that had haunted Southfield was now measurable, traceable, and within reach. Technology reveals what killers pray to hide. Subscribe to follow more cases solved by science. Detective Vance's investigation had reached a point where traditional methods could go no further. That was when Dr. Anya Sharma entered the picture. A genealogy specialist with an extraordinary talent for tracing familial connections, Sharma was accustomed to untangling the complex web of human ancestry to reveal truths long hidden. She approached the Johnson case with meticulous care, knowing that decades-old crimes could sometimes be solved by following the quiet trail of genetics. Sharma's work was painstaking. Each DNA sequence became a clue, each distant relative a potential link to the unknown killer. Using public genealogical databases, historical records, and careful elimination, she began mapping a family tree that stretched across generations, states, and decades. Forensics had given them a ghost. Genealogy gave them a path to its identity. The task was enormous. The DNA from the blood and fingerprint was not in any criminal database. The killer had left no prior legal trace. Only by following shared genetic markers could they hope to find a living relative, someone whose connection might point directly to the man who had vanished from history. Sharma's skill lay in turning scattered data into a coherent narrative, a roadmap that could lead straight to the source. As the investigation progressed, Vance watched in admiration. Sharma had the rare ability to make distant, abstract connections feel immediate and actionable. Every relative traced, every branch pruned, brought them closer to understanding not only who the killer was, but how he had managed to live undetected for nearly 50 years. Her work was a fusion of science, history, and intuition, offering a glimmer of hope to a case that had long been frozen in time. The DNA profile of the killer offered a tantalizing clue, but by itself, it could not name a person. That's where Dr. Sharma's expertise transformed the investigation. By comparing the genetic markers to distant cousins, she began to reveal connections that were invisible to the untrained eye. Each match was a thread, and when woven together, they started to form the outline of a family. Some relatives were easy to trace. Distant third or fourth cousins whose lives left public footprints in records, social media, and genealogical archives. Others required careful digging, their existence obscured by time, relocations, or incomplete documentation. Sharma and Vance worked together to follow each lead, eliminating individuals whose age, location, or circumstances in 1977 made them impossible candidates. This methodical process was both frustrating and exhilarating. A single misplaced assumption could divert them from the true path, but every successful connection strengthened the net closing around the unknown man. Slowly, branches of the family tree were pruned, narrowing the field of potential suspects. Each step brought the team closer to transforming an anonymous genetic sequence into a real, living person who had been hiding in plain sight. The tension mounted as the circle tightened. A handful of men fit the profile, each living quietly in the Midwest, each with no criminal record and no obvious connection to the crime. The ordinary lives of these men made the stakes higher. The killer could be anyone, someone the community had trusted for decades. Yet, the genetic roadmap was precise. With every eliminated branch, the phantom grew more defined, and the shadow of suspicion converged on fewer and fewer possibilities. The investigation was reaching a decisive point. The next breakthrough could finally give a name to the decades of unanswered questions. And then, after meticulous pruning, a single name emerged, casting a long shadow over the search for justice. As the genealogical analysis progressed, Dr. Sharma and Detective Vance found themselves focusing on a small cluster of men, each with a plausible link to the genetic profile. From dozens of potential relatives, the field had narrowed to 3, all living quietly in the Detroit metropolitan area in 1977. The breakthrough was both exhilarating and chilling. One wrong move, one overlooked detail, and years of painstaking work could be wasted. Each of the 3 men seemed ordinary, almost invisible in their daily routines. One was a factory worker who had recently moved to the area. Another, a teacher with a steady family life. And the third, a groundskeeper who appeared unremarkable at first glance. None had criminal records. None had drawn attention. Yet, somewhere within these unassuming lives was the man responsible for Edna Johnson's disappearance. Vance understood the stakes. These were not names on a paper, they were human beings, each with families, histories, and routines that could easily be disrupted by suspicion. Every step had to be precise. Surveillance, background checks, and cross-referencing of historical employment and location records were the only way to move forward without alerting the wrong person. The team's focus sharpened with every cross-reference. The killer had to match not only the DNA and fingerprint, but also the logistical realities of 1977. Proximity to the scene, opportunity, and age. Slowly, the evidence coalesced around a single individual whose life had remained hidden in plain sight for nearly 5 decades. By eliminating the other 2, the investigators were left with one name that refused to blend into the crowd. One man who carried decades of unanswered questions. The tension was almost unbearable. The next step would change everything, turn the phantom into a man with a name. After weeks of tracing, eliminating, and cross-referencing, the genealogy work had finally converged on a single name, Orin Hayes. The revelation sent a chill through the cold case team. For 46 years, this man had lived unnoticed, a quiet presence in his community, entirely unconnected to suspicion until now. The phantom fingerprint and blood were no longer anonymous. They had a living, breathing owner. Orin Hayes, a 72-year-old retired school groundskeeper, appeared the very definition of ordinariness. Records showed a life rooted in the Midwest, a career that kept him close to home, and a personal history that seemed devoid of malice. Yet the DNA and fingerprint evidence left no doubt. He was the individual responsible for what had haunted Southfield since 1977. The contrast between the benign life he had built and the crime he had committed was both shocking and deeply unsettling. Detective Vance and Dr. Sharma took a moment to absorb the weight of the discovery. The genealogical trail had done more than reveal a suspect. It had finally given a face and a name to the decades of anguish endured by the Johnson family. This was the breakthrough that years of investigative frustration could never achieve. For the community, the name was just words on a page, but for the investigators, it represented decades of unresolved pain, now focused on a single target. Every detail of Orin Hayes' life became crucial. His movements in 1977, his proximity to Edna Johnson's disappearance, and the life he had led, carefully obscured behind the mask of normalcy. The final step was approaching. The man whose existence had been nearly invisible for almost half a century now had a name, and with it, the possibility of justice grew closer than ever. The stage was set for the confrontation that would shake Southfield to its core. Orin Hayes had spent decades building a life that seemed ordinary, even admirable. To his neighbors, he was the friendly man who walked his dog each morning, helped coach little league teams, and volunteered quietly at the local church thrift store. He never drew attention, never spoke of the past, and carried an aura of calm reliability that made him nearly invisible. This invisibility was his greatest camouflage. In a community like Southfield, where trust was high and danger felt remote, no one would suspect that behind the gentle smile and routine gestures lay a man responsible for a decades-old crime. Every interaction, every small act of kindness, added layers to the mask he wore effortlessly. For Detective Vance, understanding this duality was crucial. Orin's ordinary existence highlighted a chilling reality. Predators can blend seamlessly into their communities, often for decades, shielded by normalcy and routine. The contrast between the image the world knew and the truth concealed in shadows was staggering. Neighbors would speak of his kindness without ever imagining his capacity for violence. A man like Orin didn't just hide in plain sight. He exploited it. His life was a study in contrast, gentle afternoons at the park, quietly watching the world, while a past crime remained locked away, waiting for justice decades later. Do you believe people can hide darkness behind decades of kindness? The most unsettling truth about Orin Hayes was not just the crime itself. It was the way he had avoided suspicion for decades. Predators often rely on invisibility, blending seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. Their routine, civility, and outward respectability act as shields, allowing them to move through society without drawing scrutiny. Orin's life was a masterclass in this deception. He attended community events, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, and appeared completely ordinary in every sense. He never flaunted wealth, never drew attention through aggression, and never gave anyone a reason to question him. This was the kind of quiet that breeds false security, the kind that can lull entire communities into believing danger is always elsewhere. For families like the Johnsons, the randomness of the attack intensified the horror. Edna Johnson had no connection to Orin Hayes beyond her simple presence that December evening in 1977. He had chosen a victim not out of malice toward her specifically, but because opportunity intersected with his impulse. This unpredictability is what makes such crimes feel so personal to anyone watching or listening. because it could happen to someone you know, in a place you trust. Detective Vance knew that understanding this behavior was critical to solving cold cases. Recognizing patterns of concealed normalcy, combined with modern technology, could finally reveal individuals who have been hidden in plain sight for decades. Orin's story serves as a chilling reminder. Evil often wears the most familiar face. A neighbor, a coworker, a friendly volunteer. All of them could conceal intentions long buried, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And it is precisely this invisibility that makes uncovering the truth so necessary and so shocking when revealed. Edna Johnson's disappearance was not the result of a long-standing feud, nor was it a premeditated plan targeting her specifically. Orin Hayes had no personal connection to her, no lingering grudge, no motive beyond the cruel intersection of opportunity and impulse. The randomness of her selection adds a layer of emotional weight that resonates far beyond the original crime. This randomness is what makes such crimes so terrifying. It reinforces the fragile sense of security we often take for granted. One moment, a neighborhood is safe and predictable. The next, a life is taken. A family left with an emptiness that cannot be measured. The terror is compounded because it could happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. For the Johnson family, this randomness was a torment that persisted for decades. Every unanswered question, every anniversary, every empty chair at the holiday table was a reminder that justice had not been served. Franklin Johnson, in particular, carried this weight silently. His grief compounded by the fact that the perpetrator's identity remained unknown for nearly 50 years. Detective Vance understood that uncovering this truth required more than simply identifying the killer. It demanded understanding the chilling pattern of randomness. Predators like Orin often strike without warning, leaving communities scrambling to make sense of events that are, by their very nature, senseless. This knowledge, while unsettling, is also empowering, recognizing the traits of those who hide behind ordinary lives. Understanding how opportunity can intersect with malevolence, and supporting investigative efforts are all ways to confront these crimes. The randomness does not have to leave us helpless. It can fuel vigilance, awareness, and ultimately, justice. When the truth about Orin Hayes came to light, the quiet streets of Southfield and Novi were shaken. Neighbors who had waved to him for decades, who had shared casual greetings and polite conversations, struggled to reconcile the gentle, unassuming man they knew with the cold-blooded killer he had been. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable, the idea that someone so ordinary could harbor such darkness for nearly 50 years. Community members expressed a mixture of disbelief, fear, and grief. Parents questioned the safety of the world they had trusted, while friends and colleagues reflected on the countless small interactions they had shared with him, wondering if they had missed some subtle clue, some hidden sign. For many, Orin Hayes' life was a stark reminder that evil does not always announce itself with loud warnings. Sometimes, it thrives quietly, patiently, hidden behind years of civility and routine. Detective Vance reflected on this duality as he prepared for the final stages of the investigation. Understanding the quiet, ordinary facade that allowed a killer to remain undetected for decades was critical, not only for justice in this case but as a lesson for future investigations. The juxtaposition between Orin's benign public life and the horrors of his past illustrated the importance of vigilance and modern investigative tools. For the audience, the revelation serves as both a warning and a lesson. Communities often assume safety, taking comfort in the familiar. Yet some truths lie hidden behind decades of ordinary existence. Awareness, attentiveness, and an understanding of human behavior can sometimes reveal what has been deliberately concealed. The story of Orin Hayes is not just the account of a long unsolved crime. It is a reflection on the fragility of trust, the randomness of danger, and the uncomfortable truth that darkness can live quietly among us, unseen for years, until time and technology bring it into the light. Detective Vance and his team knew that patience would be their greatest ally. Orin Hayes had lived decades without drawing suspicion, and any misstep could alert him to the scrutiny now focused on his quiet life. Surveillance began in earnest long hours, distant observation, cataloging routines that had long gone unnoticed. Every trip to the grocery store, every morning walk, every errand was noted, logged, and analyzed. The team observed him silently, blending into the background as if they were shadows themselves. Hayes moved through his day with the ease of decades of ordinary existence. He greeted neighbors, carried groceries, and sipped coffee at the local shop. Nothing seemed remarkable. Nothing suggested that this seemingly harmless man carried the weight of a crime that had haunted Southfield for 46 years. Yet for the detectives, each mundane detail was a piece of a larger puzzle. The world saw a quiet, retired man. The investigators saw opportunity to collect evidence that could finally link him to Edna Johnson. The challenge was immense. Gather DNA without tipping off a man who had spent nearly half a century remaining invisible. Every step had to be precise, methodical, and careful, knowing that decades of secrecy could crumble in a single moment. The hours stretched into days. Every discarded wrapper, every brief interaction with others, was a potential clue. Every routine movement was scrutinized. The tension was relentless, because the break they sought could come at any second or not at all. Hayes had survived suspicion for decades, and now, every passing moment brought them closer to exposing the truth long buried. After days of careful observation, the breakthrough came in the most ordinary of moments. Orin Hayes entered the local coffee shop, ordered his usual black coffee, and sipped it while reading the paper. To anyone watching, it was routine, a simple act repeated countless times over the years. But for Detective Vance and his team, this was the moment that could finally unravel 46 years of uncertainty. As Hayes left the shop, he tossed the paper cup into a public trash receptacle, unaware that this small, careless gesture carried the weight of decades. The cup was immediately retrieved by the team, carefully handled to preserve any trace of biological material. What the world saw as a trivial act, a discarded coffee cup, held the potential to finally confirm the identity of a man who had hidden in plain sight for nearly half a century. The tension was palpable among the investigators. They understood that the evidence on this ordinary cup could be the key to connecting Orin Hayes to the crime scene from 1977. This was the moment when technology and patience intersected with human error, when a lifetime of secrecy could be undone by a single, fleeting act. For years, the killer had relied on invisibility, on routine, and on time to shield him. Now, the simplest of gestures had handed investigators the tool they needed. This small, overlooked item, the coffee cup, was about to speak loudly for the silent decades, providing the DNA confirmation that would finally bring closure to a community that had waited far too long for justice. Most killers think time protects them, but DNA never forgets. The lab technicians worked through the night, acutely aware of the gravity of the evidence in their hands. The coffee cup, ordinary and unassuming, now held the power to expose a decades-old secret. Cells collected from the rim were analyzed, processed, and compared against the DNA profile extracted from the Ford Pinto in 1977. Every step was painstaking, but the promise of resolution kept the team relentless. When the phone call came to Detective Vance the following morning, the room seemed to pause. The lab director's voice was low, precise, and heavy with the weight of confirmation. The cells from the discarded cup matched the DNA recovered from the crime scene, a perfect, unequivocal match. Orin Hayes, the man who had walked unnoticed through the community for nearly 50 years, was undeniably linked to Edna Johnson's disappearance. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Time, which the killer had relied upon as a shield, had been powerless against modern forensic science. DNA, unyielding and permanent, had waited patiently across decades to reveal the truth. What had been hidden in shadows and forgotten files was now illuminated by science and tenacity. For Detective Vance, the revelation was both triumph and sobering reminder. Justice, delayed for nearly half a century, had finally caught up. For the Johnson family, it marked the beginning of closure, a painful but necessary step toward peace, after a lifetime of uncertainty. The coffee cup, an item so ordinary it could have been overlooked, had become the vessel through which truth was delivered. This moment reaffirmed a chilling lesson. The most careful concealment cannot withstand the meticulous patience of science and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Time may give killers confidence, but evidence, once preserved, never lies. The news of the DNA match spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through Southfield and Novi. Neighbors who had seen Orin Hayes as the quiet, friendly man on their street were forced to confront an unimaginable truth. The man they had waved to, smiled at, and trusted for decades was now identified as the person responsible for a crime that had haunted their community for 46 years. Detective Vance and his team shared a mixture of relief and solemnity. Relief that the mystery had been solved, that the evidence had finally spoken. Somber acknowledgement that a life had been lost, and decades of uncertainty inflicted pain that could never be fully undone. The juxtaposition of the ordinary man and the extraordinary evil he had concealed for decades created an almost unbearable tension between justice achieved and grief endured. For the public, the revelation was both fascination and horror. How could a man so unremarkable in daily life commit a crime so devastating? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Stories of his kindness and quiet demeanor circulated alongside the grim details of the cold case, reinforcing the chilling reality that appearances are often deceptive. Yet, within this shock was a glimmer of resolution. The relentless pursuit of truth, the integration of modern technology with old evidence, had finally illuminated the darkness. Franklin Johnson and the rest of Edna's family could now begin the slow process of healing, armed with the knowledge that justice, even decades late, had arrived. This moment cemented a fundamental truth for everyone following the case. No matter how long time has passed, the combination of diligence, modern forensic tools, and unrelenting determination can reveal what has been hidden, ensuring that even the most careful concealment cannot remain permanent. At dawn, the quiet suburban streets of Novi were interrupted by the precise movement of law enforcement. Detective Vance and a tactical team approached Orin Hayes' home, prepared for the inevitable confrontation, yet aware that decades of ordinary behavior could make him unpredictable. The early morning calm, the chirping birds, and the gentle light of sunrise contrasted starkly with the tension that gripped the investigators. Hayes opened his front door, housecoat loosely draped, crossword puzzle in hand. There was no immediate recognition of the danger that now stood before him. For nearly 50 years, he had walked undetected among neighbors, friends, and family, shielding a dark secret behind a facade of normalcy. In this single moment, the life he had carefully constructed came crashing down. His composure faltered the instant he saw the badge and the resolute eyes of Detective Vance. The silence was heavy, broken only by Hayes' whispered admission. "It took you a long time." Those 5 words, simple yet loaded with meaning, carried the weight of decades of hidden guilt, arrogance, and the chilling awareness of a life lived undisturbed. The arrest was executed smoothly, without resistance. Hayes' body, once a symbol of quiet suburban life, was now a reminder of the hidden horrors that can linger behind the most ordinary of doors. For the team, there was a mixture of relief, apprehension, and a sense of justice poised to be delivered. This moment marked the transition from decades of unanswered questions to a confrontation with truth. The man who had avoided detection for nearly 50 years would now be forced to face the reality of his actions. The peaceful morning of Novi would never feel the same, and the long, patient pursuit of justice had finally reached its first tangible victory. Once in custody, Hayes was led to the interrogation room, a stark, fluorescent-lit space that offered no comfort, no escape. The room had witnessed countless confessions, but few carried the weight of decades-long secrecy. Detective Vance and his partner, Detective Hollis Reed, entered with a quiet authority, fully aware that the next hours could finally unveil the truth that had eluded the Southfield police for nearly 50 years. Hayes sat quietly, his face a mask of resignation, his hands clasped on the table. He had lived decades hiding a crime, and now the walls closed in with the inevitability of accountability. Vance began gently, probing memories, asking questions, giving the suspect space to speak. The tension was unbearable not just for the investigators, but for the silent witnesses of history. The files, the evidence, and the unanswered grief of a family waiting over 40 years. Hours passed. Hayes' initial defiance began to erode under the unrelenting presence of truth. Each question, each carefully presented fact, chipped away at the defenses he had maintained for a lifetime. The detectives revealed details from the cold case, the Ford Pinto, the blue coat, the discarded purse, all elements that linked him undeniably to the crime. Slowly, the silence that had protected Hayes for decades began to break. The first acknowledgments came hesitantly, a tremor in his voice. The confession would not be immediate, but the cracks had appeared, signaling that the carefully constructed barrier of lies and denial was failing. This was the moment where time, evidence, and human perseverance intersected. The man who had remained invisible, who had walked freely among unsuspecting neighbors, was now facing the inevitable confrontation with his actions. The path to justice was unfolding, one revelation at a time, and the story that had haunted a family for nearly half a century was finally nearing its emotional climax. After hours of relentless questioning, Hayes' defenses crumbled completely. The confession began in a whisper, almost casual, yet carrying the immense weight of truth. He admitted to seeing Edna Johnson on the night of December 9, 1977, walking alone in her blue coat, heading to a holiday gathering. The act had been sudden, driven by impulse, a violent decision that would haunt countless lives. Hayes described how he lured her to his vehicle, the Ford Pinto, now etched forever in the memories of investigators and the Johnson family. The quiet, calculated actions he had taken to conceal his presence, the absence of robbery, the careful leaving of her purse and keys, revealed a chilling understanding of how to manipulate appearances. His admission transformed cold clues into a story of real human tragedy. He disclosed the disposal of Edna's body in a remote, waterlogged area deep within Holly State Recreation Area, a place the original search parties had overlooked by mere yards. Each detail, precise and unsettling, painted a vivid picture of the final moments that had remained a mystery for decades. The confession confirmed suspicions, linked decades-old evidence to a living man, and provided a narrative that reconciled the scattered fragments of the investigation. For Detective Vance and his team, the weight of the confession was heavy. Justice, long delayed, was finally manifesting in concrete truths. Every subtle clue documented in 1977 partial fingerprint, microscopic blood, abandoned purse, was now part of a cohesive story, illuminating a timeline that had remained hidden for nearly 50 years. The community's silent anxiety, the Johnson family's enduring grief, and the relentless pursuit of truth converged in this moment. Hayes' words brought clarity and shock in equal measure, transforming decades of unanswered questions into a narrative of accountability that would finally demand recognition and closure. The confession rippled through Southfield and Novi, leaving a mixture of shock, disbelief, and relief in its wake. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the gentle, quiet man they had known for decades with the horrifying actions Hayes had admitted. The dissonance between the everyday kindness he displayed and the crime he had concealed for nearly 50 years was jarring, unsettling the foundation of trust the community had relied upon. For Franklin Johnson, the revelation carried a deeply personal weight. Years of silent grief, of marking December 9th with a single blue rose, were finally met with the acknowledgement of truth. The empty chair at family gatherings, the unanswered questions, the decades of emotional torment, these began to find resolution. Franklin could now honor Edna's memory, and with the eventual recovery of her remains, he provided her the dignity of a proper resting place. The broader community, though shaken, also experienced a measure of relief. The fear of the unknown, the shadow of uncertainty that had lingered for decades, was lifted. Residents who had looked upon Hayes' ordinary life with trust now understood the terrifying complexity of human behavior and the patience required to unearth long-hidden truths. Detective Vance and his team, felt the culmination of years of dedication and perseverance. Their meticulous efforts, bridging the gap between old evidence and modern technology, had brought closure to a case that had once seemed hopeless. The triumph was not only in the arrest and confession but in the validation it provided to a grieving family and a community that had endured decades of unanswered questions. This emotional reckoning emphasized a fundamental lesson. Justice, even delayed for decades, retains its power. Truth can emerge from the shadows of time, and the human cost of unresolved crimes underscores the vital importance of relentless pursuit and unwavering resolve. The day Franklin Johnson had waited for over 46 years finally arrived. The winter chill in Southfield felt less like a cold burden and more like a solemn embrace as he prepared to lay his sister to rest. For decades, he had carried the weight of unanswered questions, the invisible ache of a sibling lost without explanation. Today, the sorrow that had been private, silent, and enduring would meet the public acknowledgement of justice. Franklin approached the grave with a single blue rose in hand, a ritual maintained every December 9th, now transformed from remembrance to closure. Each step across the snow-dusted ground carried memories of laughter, the warmth of family, and the cruel absence that had dominated his life. The world had moved on, but for him, every year had been marked by the echo of Edna's absence, a ghostly companion through ordinary days. As the casket was lowered into the earth, Franklin whispered words that bridged decades. Grief, apology for the long wait, and a promise that her story would never be forgotten. The quiet congregation family, close friends, and the detectives who had solved the case witnessed the profound relief mingled with sorrow. This was not just a burial. It was the final act in a narrative that had begun in tragedy and ended in painstaking resolution. For Franklin, the act of burying his sister was more than an emotional release. It was the reclamation of dignity for Edna, a restoration of what had been stolen by violence and time. As the earth closed above her, decades of waiting, pain, and unanswered questions were met with the bittersweet solace that justice had finally prevailed. The headstone, simple yet powerful, bore words that carried the weight of decades. Edna Johnson, 1950, 1977. At peace, after 46 years. Each letter etched into cold stone represented a life interrupted, a family's grief, and a community's collective shock finally met with resolution. Franklin stood before it, hands trembling slightly, the culmination of years of unanswered questions and lingering sorrow pressing down in a moment of profound stillness. This marker was more than a gravestone, it was a declaration of truth, a testimony that time cannot erase injustice. It honored Edna not only for the life she lived but for the patience demanded of those left behind, who had carried her memory like a fragile ember through decades of uncertainty. For Franklin, the simple act of reading her name aloud, felt like reclaiming a part of his own heart, long buried under the weight of loss. Neighbors, friends, and investigators who had followed the case for years shared in the quiet ceremony, understanding that closure comes not from forgetting, but from finally acknowledging the full reality of what occurred. The emotional resonance of seeing justice served after so many years reminded everyone present that perseverance, empathy, and diligence have the power to correct even the longest-standing wrongs. As the last few petals of Franklin's blue rose fell onto the grave, a sense of fragile peace settled over the cemetery. Edna's story, once trapped in files and fading memories, now had a permanent place, a tangible symbol that, even after decades, truth and remembrance can finally align. The headstone was not just stone, it was a promise kept, a testament to the enduring need for justice, and a reminder that even the darkest mysteries can find resolution with patience and resolve. The resolution of Edna Johnson's case underscored a dramatic shift in the power of forensic science. In 1977, detectives were limited to fingerprints on paper, smudged traces of blood, and handwritten notes, a fragile hope for justice. Today, DNA analysis, AFIS fingerprint comparison, and genetic genealogy have transformed the investigative landscape. Cold cases that once seemed impossible now yield their secrets, proving that time is not always an ally for those who seek to hide wrongdoing. Detective Vance's work highlighted the meticulous patience required to bridge decades of evidence with modern technology. Each smudged print, each microscopic blood sample, once mute and meaningless, became a narrative of accountability. Science gave voice to the silenced, turning vague suspicions into irrefutable facts. It was a stark reminder that the persistence of investigators, paired with technological evolution, can finally restore dignity to victims and relief to families. At the same time, Hayes' decades-long concealment exposed a chilling reality. Predators can live seemingly ordinary lives for decades, evading suspicion behind the guise of normalcy. The unassuming neighbor, the volunteer, the coach, these were roles that shielded a dangerous truth, allowing darkness to persist unnoticed. The case forces reflection on the delicate balance between trust and vigilance, and the need for communities to remain aware without succumbing to fear. The story of Edna Johnson is a dual lesson. The relentless march of science can unveil truths hidden for generations, and the facades of ordinary life can conceal extraordinary malice. Justice, though delayed, is amplified when it intersects with modern tools, proving that even the quietest crimes leave traces that refuse to be ignored. The conclusion of this case leaves a stark, unforgettable lesson. Danger does not always announce itself with warning signs. It can reside quietly in the heart of someone we think we know, hidden behind decades of ordinary behavior. Hayes' decades-long concealment illustrates that vigilance and awareness are essential, even in the places we believe are safest. Trust is precious, but awareness is protection. Edna Johnson's story also emphasizes the unyielding power of justice. Though delayed by decades, the combination of relentless investigation, modern technology, and unwavering dedication brought closure to a family and a community. Franklin Johnson, carrying the weight of grief for nearly half a century, finally reclaimed a measure of peace. The moral is clear. Truth, once uncovered, restores dignity and ensures that no crime remains truly forgotten. Communities and individuals alike are reminded that the tools of justice have evolved. DNA, genetic genealogy, and modern forensic science are not just methods, they are lifelines for the long-forgotten victims and reminders that time alone cannot protect those who commit unspeakable acts. The convergence of patience, science, and human perseverance proves that even the most hidden crimes can be illuminated. As we close this chapter, remember, the ordinary can conceal extraordinary darkness, and the passage of time does not erase responsibility. Cases like this compel us to remain vigilant, to value the work of investigators, and to recognize that justice, however delayed, remains inevitable. Cases like this prove danger hides in plain sight. Stay aware, subscribe so no truth stays buried around you.